My name is Alana Jones, and I'm in the Cording Lab. And for the lab teaching today, we'll be talking about a history of transhumanist thought. I would like to begin that transhumanism. I chose this topic because it seems to be very relevant today, yesterday, and tomorrow. Last time when we talked about transhumanism, I realized that I didn't know that much about it, and it's felt really important, especially given the announcement by Elon Musk and you know, how science and technology turns ever onward into the future. So with that, I will start discussing the history of transhumanist thought. And this is a summary and some of my own thoughts on the paper of this title by Nick Bostrom. So first, I want to talk about what transhumanism is. First, I'm going to give you a definition by Mark O'Connell, who's a literary journalist and not a transhumanist. His definition is, and I'll be doing this a lot, reading the text, so bear with me. As humans, we are defined by, among other things, our desire to transcend our humanity. Mythology, religion, fiction, and science offer different versions of this dream. Transhumanism, a social movement predicated on the belief that we can and should leave behind our biological condition by merging with technology, is a kind of feverish amalgamation of all four. Though it's oriented toward the future and is fueled by excitable speculation about the implications of the latest science and technology, its roots can be glimpsed in ancient stories like that of the Sumerian king Gilgamesh in his quest for immortality. As a contrast, I'll read a bit of talking about transhumanism from a transhumanist, future and writer of The Singularity is Near, Ray Kurzweil. He says, evolution moves toward greater complexity, greater elegance, greater knowledge, greater intelligence, greater beauty, greater creativity, and greater levels of subtle attributes such as love. In every monotheistic tradition, God is likewise described as all of these qualities, only without limitation. Infinite knowledge, infinite intelligence, infinite beauty, and infinite creativity, infinite love, and so on. Of course, even the accelerating growth of evolution never achieves an infinite level, but as it explodes exponentially, it certainly moves rapidly in that direction. So evolution moves inexorably towards this conception of God, although never quite reaching this ideal. We can regard, therefore, the freeing of our thinking from the severe limitations of its biological form to be an essentially spiritual undertaking. I chose these two authors because I feel like they are on two sides, well, not two sides of the same spectrum, but rather, you know, both very interested in this topic and have somewhat different definitions. Next brings me to Nick Bostrom, who is a philosopher at Oxford, a co-founder of the World Transhumanist Association. And he wrote the paper that I'm about to summarize in 2005. It's 15 years out of date, and many things have happened since then. And perhaps in the discussion, we can talk about those things. But right now, know that this paper goes from 1700 BC to 2005. So to begin the paper, we'll be talking about the first section, cultural and philosophical antecedents of transhumanism. So the early seeds might be found in the quest for immortality and transcendence. So remember Mark O'Connell's definition and the reference to the Epic of Gilgamesh. This summary of this is that a king sets out on a quest for immortality. Gilgamesh learns that there exists a natural means, an herb that grows at the bottom of the sea. He successfully retrieves that plant, but a snake steals it from him before he can eat it. This story, along with explorers in the Fountain of Youth, alchemists in the Elixir of Life, Taoism reaching physical immortality by way of harmony with the forces of nature, and even Greek mythology, which actually illustrates a sort of ambivalence toward human transcendence of limitation and introduces the concept of hubris as seen in the myth of Prometheus, where Prometheus stole fire from Zeus and gave it to humans, thereby permanently improving the human condition. Yet for this act, he was severely punished by Zeus. I will take a break from these ancient stories and try to define humanism because it will help with the development of a new way of thinking that began the march toward transhumanism as a movement. So humanism is an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. The bolded aspects of humanism came in stages and not all at once. So first, I'll talk about Renaissance humanism, which encouraged people to rely on their own observations and their own judgment rather than defer in every matter to religious authorities. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, in the Oration on the Dignity of Man, speaks about humanism here. We have made you a creature neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal or immortal, in order that you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being, fashion yourself in a form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower brutish forms of life. You will be able, through your own decision, to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine. The beginnings of science is also talked about in Francis Bacon's Novum Organum in 1620, where he proposes scientific methodology based on empirical investigation. Note, pause here, that empirical investigation stems from this humanist way of thinking where people rely on their own observations, aka empirical evidence. So based on empirical investigation rather than in a priori reasoning. Bacon advocated the project of affecting all things possible, by which he meant using science to achieve mastery over nature in order to improve the living condition of human beings. Starting from those bases, famous people started to yearn to change themselves via science, not themselves specifically, but ourselves as humanity. And this was based in rational humanism, which emphasizes empirical science and critical reason rather than revelation and religious authority as ways of learning about the natural world and our place within it, and of providing a grounding for morality. Transhumanism has roots in rational humanism, direct roots. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we're beginning to think that humans themselves can be developed or changed through the application of science. For example, French philosopher and mathematician Condorcet mused about anti-aging through medicine. Our very own Ben Franklin mused about suspended animation, foreshadowing the cryonics movement. And after publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, it became increasingly plausible to view the current version of humanity not as an endpoint of evolution, but as an early phase. And lastly, Julien Offray de la Mettrie in L'Homme Machine, I don't know if I pronounced that right, basically argued that if human beings are constituted of matter, obeying the same laws of physics that operate outside us, then it should be in principle be possible to learn to manipulate human nature in the same way that we manipulate external objects. Science came out of this general way of thinking. And lastly, to kind of get a sense of, I'm going to keep saying lastly by accident, sorry, but transhumanism's Enlightenment roots kind of give an idea as to the general attitudes that transhumanists generally think and have that is generally shared by many. So Immanuel Kant defines enlightenment and what is enlightenment in 1784. He says that enlightenment is man's leaving his self-caused immaturity. Immaturity is the incapacity to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Such immaturity is self-caused if its cause is not lack of intelligence, but by lack of determination and courage to use one's intelligence without being guided by another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore, sapere aude, have courage to use your own intelligence. Following enlightenment, fast forward 100 years, Friedrich Nietzsche speaks on der Übermensch, or the Overman, in 1883-5. He says, I teach you the Overman. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him? All beings so far have created something beyond themselves. And do you want to be the ebb of this great flood and even go back to the beasts rather than overcome man? In this, Nietzsche was talking more about a kind of soaring personal growth and cultural refinement in exceptional individuals. Keep in mind these general attitudes when thinking about transhumanism. So that ends the section on the precedents of transhumanism. Next, we'll go into the next section, which talks about speculation, science fiction, and 20th century totalitarianism. At the end of this section, we'll actually get to the coining of the term transhumanism and a point in history where we can point to that says, this is where transhumanism was named. So in a way, futurist J.B.S. Haldane published Daedalus, or Science in the Future, and he predicted a wealthier society with abundant clean energy, where genetics would be employed to make people taller, healthier, and smarter, and where ectogenesis, or rather the incubation of human beings outside of the womb, the human womb, would be commonplace. This set off a chain of future-oriented discussions, and also in this work, he commented on what has recently been called the Yuck factor, which is a factor that everyone can probably think of. He describes it here. The chemical or physical inventor is always a Prometheus. There is no great invention, from fire to flying, which has not been hailed as an insult to some god. But if every physical and chemical invention is a blasphemy, every biological invention is a perversion. There is hardly one which, on first being, brought to the notice of an observer from any nation which has not previously heard of their existence, would not appear to him as indecent and unnatural. This futurist optimist, definitely sparked a very large and wide discussion. And some of that discussion was met with pessimism and through the form of a critique in science fiction. So British polymath and Nobel laureate Bertrand Russell published his essay, Icarus, The Future of Science, in 1924. He argued that without more kindliness in the world, technological power would mainly serve to increase our ability to harm one another. Also, British writers Aldous Huxley and George Orwell added on to this general criticism through their publishing of Brave New World in 1984, very famous novels. It should be noted that in neither book is technology employed to increase human capacities. Rather, society is set up to repress the full development of humanity. Both dystopias curtail scientific and technological exploration for fear of upsetting the social equilibrium. On the dehumanizing potential of the use of technology to promote social conformism and shallow contentment, these books were on. So, and that's kind of the futurism meets some criticism. And futuristic thinking also made people think about the evolution of human beings and the human gene pool. Early 20th century, not only did racists and right-wing ideologues, but also a number of left-leaning social progressives became concerned about the effects of medicine and social safety nets on the quality of the human gene pool. That was said in the essay very tongue-in-cheek. But basically, whether or not people were able to reproduce or survive led to this kind of concern for the human gene pool. State-sponsored eugenics programs were implemented in many countries, including the USA, Canada, Australia, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Switzerland. And in the US between 1907 and 1963, some 64,000 individuals were forcibly sterilized via these eugenics programs. The Holocaust, resulting from the German eugenics program, was the systematic murder of millions of people regarded as inferior by the Nazis, thinking in this human gene pool and that concern of that leading to this way of thinking. So what did the futurists do in response to this? After World War II, futurists who had become suspicious of collectively orchestrated social change found a new home for their hopes in scientific and technological progress. And so brings us to the coinage of the term transhumanism. Evolutionary biologist, eugenicist, and internationalist Julian Huxley coined transhumanism by publishing New Bottles for New Wine in 1957. In it, he says, the human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself, not just sporadically, an individual here in one way, an individual there in another way, but it's in its entirety as humanity. We need a name for this new belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. Man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature. And that brings us to transhumanism and now the technological genies, AI, the singularity, nanotechnology, and uploading. And in this section, I'll be talking about each of those four, and lastly, summarizing general transhumanist views in line with the ever more progressing march of technological development. To the right here, you'll see Alan Turing, and he wrote in Computing Machinery and Intelligence, describing the Turing test, in which a human experimenter interviews a computer and another human being via a text interface. The computer succeeds if the interviewer cannot reliably distinguish it from a human. And this point of AI development was predicted to come much sooner than it has. Many early AI researchers turned out to be over-optimistic about the timescale of AI development, and many people put forward reasons to take seriously that this development could happen within the first half of this century, including Marvin Minsky, whose name I spelled wrong, Hans Moravec, Ray Kurzweil, and the writer of this history, Nick Bostrom. Note that we are in 2020 and we are in a deep learning, machine learning lab. The field is burgeoning and bursting, and perhaps these, these predictions may actually be coming sooner than we think. Next, I talk about the singularity. In a 1958 tribute by Stanislaw Ulam, he talks about a conversation he had with John von Neumann. He says, one conversation centered on the ever-accelerating progress of technology and changes in the mode of human life, which gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue. Ray Kurzweil highlights or documents in his book, The Singularity is Near, in Moore's Law, in which he talks about Gordon E. Moore, the co-founder of Intel, noticing in 1965 that the number of transistors on a chip exhibited exponential growth. This exponential growth can be found in many areas, and this idea of exponential growth is more so the means by which we might reach a singularity, as described by John von Neumann. And statistician I.J. Good in 1965 also adds that let an ultra-intelligent machine be defined as a machine that can far surpass all the intellectual activities of any man, however clever. Since the design of machines is one of these intellectual activities, an ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. And he says this with the singularity in mind. Next, I talk about nanotechnology, and here I talk. Here you can see American engineer Eric Drexler. He published these two books on nanotechnology that brought the field forward a lot: Engines of Creation and Nanosystems in 1986 and 1992. And he also founded the Foresight Institute to prepare the world for nanotechnology and work towards its safe implementation. He says that nanotechnology can help us abolish most disease and aging, make possible the reanimation of cryonics patients. And I didn't define cryonics before, but cryonics is basically freezing someone for later resuscitation when technology has progressed to the point where death can be solved. It can enable affordable space colonization and, more ominously, lead to the rapid creation of vast arsenals of lethal or non-lethal weapons. Chemist and Nobel laureate Richard Smalley has debated Drexler, asserting that non-biological molecular assemblers are impossible. This idea that the nanotechnology and producing the nanotechnology is not possible without a biological assembler. Drexler maintains, though, despite this assertion, that the developments in nanotechnology are now a question of how difficult it will be to develop it and how long it will take. I'll say that in the summary, not much was said about uploading other than describing what it is. So it is the transfer of a human mind to a computer. It's in 4 steps. First, you image a brain where the subject either survives or does not survive this imaging. You can reconstruct a neural network with its diversity of neuron types, emulate this neural network via supercomputer, and then the person whose brain was imaged then lives in virtual reality or inhabits a robot body. This calls into question many questions about self and body and dualism and so on and so forth, and has really captured the public imagination and has been a recurring theme in science fiction since the 1950s. Some transhumanist views in light of these technologies that are currently developing or are already here. Transhumanism does not depend on the feasibility of such It's not a matter of whether or not it can be done, but it's a matter of whether or not when it will be done. There are also more technologies that kind of, bring about this idea of the merging of humanity with technology, such as virtual reality, pre-implantation, genetic diagnosis, genetic engineering, pharmaceuticals that improve memory, concentration, wakefulness, and mood, performance-enhancing drugs, cosmetic surgery, prosthetics, anti-aging medicine, closer human computer interfaces. These technologies are already here, can be expected within the next few decades. The transhumanist agenda, which is to make such enhancement options safely available to all persons, will become increasingly relevant and practical in the coming years as these and other anticipated technologies come online. So that's all on the technologies. that have been developed or currently exist or will be developed very soon. Next, this section talks about the growth of grassroots movements and the movements of people around transhumanism. First, I'd like to highlight a book by a man who's changed his name to FM 2030. That's his name. And his book is Are You Transhuman? FM 2030 is one of the first professors of future studies, teaching at the New School for Social Research in New York in the 1960s. And he can be quoted here: "Who are the new revolutionaries of our time? They are the geneticists, biologists, physicists, cryonologists, biotechnologists, nuclear scientists, cosmologists, radio astronomers, cosmonauts, social scientists, youth corps volunteers, internationalists, humanists, science fiction writers, normative thinkers, investors. They and others are revolutionizing the human condition in a fundamental way. Their achievements and goals go far beyond the most radical ideologies of the old order." He also describes what a transhuman describes signs that are indicative of transhuman status, including prostheses, plastic surgery, intensive use of telecommunications, a cosmopolitan outlook and a globe-trotting lifestyle, androgyny, mediated reproduction such as in vitro fertilization, absence of religious belief, and a rejection of traditional human values. Traditional family values. I didn't mean to say human there. However, it was never satisfactorily explained why somebody who, say, rejects human family values, has no job, and spends a lot of time on jet planes is in closer proximity to post-humanity than the rest of us. That's kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of comment by the writer. The advent of the internet also impacted the transhumanist movement and the development of modern transhumanism. The Extropy Institute was founded in 1992 after the first issue of Extropy magazine in 1988 by Max Moore and Tom Morrow. Extropy is defined as the opposite of entropy. It is a catalyst that brought together disparate groups of people with futuristic ideas, and many people got their first exposure to transhumanist views from the Extropy Institute's listserv, the internet. Max Moore also made a more modern definition of and brand of transhumanism called extropianism, which emphasized the principles of boundless expansion, self-transformation, dynamic optimism, intelligent technology, and spontaneous. Originally, extropianism had a clear libertarian flavor, but in later years, Moore has distanced himself from this ingredient, replacing spontaneous order with open society, a principle that opposes authoritarian social control and promotes decentralization of power and responsibility. Also stated in this paper is that the internet and the irrational exuberance that pervaded the dot-com era played an important role in incubating modern transhumanism. And lastly of this section, I'll talk about the World Transhumanist Association. It was founded by the writer, the writer of this paper, Nick Bostrom and David Pierce in early 1998 to provide general organizational basis for all transhumanist groups and interests across the political spectrum. The founding documents for this organization was the Transhumanist Declaration and the Transhumanist. If you want to find the Transhumanist Declaration, you can actually find this paper, A History of Transhumanist Thought, and it's in the appendix. Philosopher David Pierce also developed his own flavor of transhumanism with the ethic of hedonistic utilitarianism. The negative goal of this transhumanism is to eliminate suffering through neurotechnology. And the positive goal was to create paradise engineering so everyone experiences well-being instead of suffering. The WTA, incorporated as a nonprofit and has an international network of local groups and volunteers, now with 3,000 members in more than 100 countries, since 2005, as of 2005. The second to last section that I'll talk about is the academic frontier, mainly about ethics and other quandaries do care about, especially, and other bioethicists and medical ethicists care about with the progression of technology. So medical ethics and bioethics came about as the way practical ethics, according to Bostrom, says it made it back on the map. So revelations of the horrific experiments that the Nazis had conducted on human subjects in the name of science led to the adoption of the Nuremberg Code in 1947 and the Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, laying down strict safeguards for medical experimentation, emphasizing the need for patient consent. In 1970s, a broader kind of inquiry emerged, bioethics, stimulated particularly by developments in assisted reproduction and genetics. I need to drink some water. So the section of the paper is split into both normative and positive transhumanist matters. And I'm going to breeze through this. Each one of these has at least one book associated with it, musing about this each particular matter. And if you are interested, I do recommend that you use this presentation as a jumping off point to read more about these bioethical and transhumanist concerns. So Derek Parfit's Reasons and Persons covers personal identity, foundational ethical theory, population ethics, person affecting moral principles, and duties to future generations. Jonathan Glover's What Sort of People Should There Be considers the question, what aspects of human nature are worth preserving? Peter Singer talks about the preventative principle, which is described as, for any condition X, if it would be a form of child abuse for parents to inflict X on their child soon after birth, then it must, other things being equal, at least be permissible to take steps to prevent one's child from having that condition X. Julian Savulescu in The Principle of Procreative Beneficence is described here, where prospective parents should select the child of possible children they could have who would have the best life based on relevant available information. For example, if you have the selection between two embryos and one were and the other one would not, you would choose the one that would not. Some more normative transhumanist matters, From Chance to Choice, written by Alan Buchanan, Dan Brock, Norman Daniels, and Daniel Wickler. They examine how advances of genetic engineering could affect distributive justice, equal opportunity, our rights and obligations as parents, the meaning of disability, and the concept of human nature in ethical theory and practice. Mark Walker argues from the perfectionist standpoint that we have the duty to use technology to improve ourselves. And then Nick Bostrom and others differentiate between types of transhumanist advancements or technological advancements of human beings. There's those that enhancements that procure positional advantages, which merely only put one person at an advantage over another. And then there are intrinsic benefits or net positive externalities that might be had from the enhancement. And they claim that the second type of enhancement should be promoted. Also, Bostrom talks about exploring a larger space of possible worthwhile modes of being, where we would need a broader conception of human dignity, which can accommodate post-human dignity. Also, the ethics of superintelligence is talked about by American autodidact Eliezer Yudkowsky, and he tried to develop a theory of how to program a human-friendly AI, and argues that we should choose AI's initial conditions so that it would use its superior intellectual powers to derive the specific goals and extrapolate our decisions if we were better calibrated, better informed, and better able to reflect on forces influencing our decisions. Now for the positive questions in transhumanist matters. There's a lot of talk about existential risk, which is defined where adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. American engineer and venture capitalist Bill Joy argues in his article, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, with existential risk in mind. He says, we ought to relinquish developments in AI, nanotechnology, and genetics because the risks that will eventually emerge from these disciplines. Several have argued against Bill Joy, saying that such bans should be argued against because unrealistic, would deprive us of great benefits, and might increase rather than decrease risk if development were driven underground or to less hesitant regions of the world. And lastly, I'll talk about the simulation hypothesis, which was brought forward by Nick Bostrom in 2003, saying that it follows from fairly weak assumptions that at least one of the following propositions is true. The human species is very likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage. Any post-human civilization is extremely unlikely to run a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history or variations thereof. And 3, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. It follows that the belief that there is some significant chance that we will one day become post-humans who run ancestor simulations is false, unless we are currently living in a simulation. And then lastly, the final section in this paper talks about 21st century biopolitics, a transhumanist bioconservative dimension. So there is a new dimension to politics that is stated in this, which is called biopolitics, where if you were to have the first 2 dimensions, economic politics and cultural politics, the z-axis would be biopolitics. American sociologist and bioethicist James Hughes in Citizen Cyborg in 2004 sets forward democratic transhumanism, which mates transhumanist biopolitics with social democratic economic politics and liberal cultural politics, and argues that we will achieve the best post-human future when we ensure that technologies are safe, make them available for everyone, and respect the right of individuals to control their own bodies. He states that it is different from extropian transhumanism because it accords a much bigger role in government in regulating new technologies for safety and ensuring that the benefits will be available to all, not just a wealthy or tech-savvy elite. On the other side of biopolitics from transhumanism is bioconservatism, which opposes the use of technology to expand human capacities or to modify aspects of our biological nature. This is a big one. So the different strands of contemporary bioconservatism can be traced to a multifarious set of origins. Ancient notions of taboo, the Greek concept of hubris, the romanticist view of nature, certain religious anti-humanistic interpretations of the concept of human dignity and of a God-given natural order, the Luddite workers' revolt against industrialization, Karl Marx's analysis of technology under capitalism, various continental philosophers' critiques of technology, technocracy, and the rationalistic mindset that accompanies modern technoscience, foes of the military-industrial complex and multinational corporations, and objectors to the consumerist rat race. Also, I'd like to, I was quite pleased that there was a section on feminist biopolitics mentioned here. It says, ecofeminism on the use of biotechnology to reshape bodies or control reproduction. Some have concluded that transhumanism represents an embarrassing rationalization of self-centered immaturity and social failure. It's very negative. Others welcome transhumanism. Shulamith Firestone in The Dialectic of Sex says that women will be fully liberated only when technology has freed them from having to incubate children. And cyberfeminist Donna Haraway proclaims that she would rather be a cyborg than a goddess, and also wrote the Cyborg Manifesto, released in 1985. And there are also several prominent bioconservatives, prominent especially in 2005. Leon Kass, chairman of the President George W. Bush's Council on Bioethics, is also an American physician and scientist, has concerns on which center human dignity in the subtle ways in which our attempts to assert technological mastery over human nature could end up dehumanizing us by undermining various traditional meanings. He advocates for the wisdom of repugnance, saying that the gut feeling of revulsion is not a moral argument, but insists that the yuck factor merits our respectful attention. Also, political scientist and writer Yoshihiro Francis Fukuyama, a member of the President's Council in 2005, states that transhumanism is the world's most dangerous idea, and his chief concern is the prospect of violence and oppression, and he argues that liberal democracy depends on the fact that all humans share an undefined factor X, which grounds their equal dignity and rights. The use of enhancing technologies, he fears, could destroy factor X. There are some commonalities or agreements between transhumanists and bioconservatives. Both agree murder and enslavement, whether of humans by posthumans or of posthumans by humans, would be a moral atrocity and a crime. Both agree that we face a realistic prospect that technology could be used to substantially transform the human condition in this century. And both agree that there is an obligation on the current generation to think hard about the practical and ethical implications. And lastly, both condemn the racist and coercive state-sponsored eugenics programs of the 20th century. On human values and technological advances by both sides is that bioconservatives draw attention to the possibility that subtle human values could be eroded by technological advances. And transhumanists should perhaps learn to be more sensitive to these concerns. On the other hand, transhumanists emphasize the enormous potential for genuine improvements in human well-being and human flourishing that are attainable only via technological transformation. And bioconservatives could try to be more appreciative of the possibility that we could realize great values by venturing beyond our current biological limitations. With that, I conclude my summary of a history of transhumanist thought, and I would like to add a bit of my own contribution through my reading of James Baldwin. American writer and thinker during the Civil Rights Movement, James Baldwin writes the essay Preservation of Innocence in 1951, discussing nature, the nature of man, and the unnatural. He says, and I quote, "Life is a process of decisions and alternatives, the conscious awareness and acceptance of limitations. Experience, nevertheless, to say nothing of history, seems clearly to indicate that it is not possible to banish or to falsify any human need without ourselves undergoing falsification and loss. And what of murder? A human characteristic, surely. Must we embrace the murderer? But the question must be put another way. Is it possible not to embrace him? For he is in us and of us. We may not be free until we understand him." My thoughts on transhumanism and this passage by James Baldwin are as follows. Life involves awareness and acceptance of limitations. I would go further to say that our human limitations define human needs. Transhumanism is based on the belief of transcending our limitations through technology. Is it not the case that to falsify our needs leads to undergoing our own falsification and loss? What kind of freedom is Baldwin talking about when he says, we may not be free until we understand him? This kind of Baldwinian freedom is based on understanding of the human condition. By transcending our own human limitations, would we exchange this freedom based on understanding of our own humanity for the freedom from needs and limitations? And with that, thank you very much for listening. And are there any questions or comments?